experimenting with, we're an experimental church. So, you know, when you come on Sunday morning, there may be something that's a little bit different. Might be a little offsetting for some people, so some Sundays you may see Adam in a coat. Sometimes it might not be. Sometimes I might even wear my robe just for you, Bobby. But we do experimental things. Adam generally preaches down close to the congregation, and I like that. But as I was standing beside this is a great pulpit. It moves around, it's mobile. But I was thinking about the Saturday Night Live skit. You know the one I'm talking about, with the press secretary that has the mobile podium and is running over, runs over the. If you fall asleep, maybe you may look up and I won't be there. One spring day when I was working in Arkansas, campus ministry in Arkansas, not Arkansas State, it was demolished yesterday here, but at the University of Arkansas. Our campus ministry took a group of students to the Buffalo River to float. Not down in the area that's called the Buffalo River State Park, but up in the area where there's a lot of white water. Tradition of that campus ministry was that twice a year we would go on a float trip, and students loved it. We had on this particular trip there was a beautiful spring day. And I had missed the fall trip, but we usually go in the fall and in the spring. One reason I missed the fall trip is that the only other Buffalo River float trip that I had been in, I spent a lot of time in the water. There's a word for that called tongue. And my colleague, I was associate director of campus ministry there, and my colleague liked to pair experienced canoeists with novices. And the first time I went, I was the novice, but I didn't realize, and he didn't realize either, that the other guy was a novice too. At least he canoed like a novice. We talked over 8 times, and it was in November. I didn't go back the next trip. On the third trip after I had moved to Arkansas and was a part of this campus ministry, I decided I would go again. And I took with me my Carol, who was my first wife. We divorced. We're divorced now. Get that out, But anyway, I took Carol and I went on the trip, and we had made on this canoe trip, and we had done really, really well. I maybe only jumped over twice, And we had passed some of the big obstacles in the river. There was Gray Rock, which is where a lot of people had trouble, and then there was Wrecking Rock, where more people had trouble. And at Wrecking Rock, the experienced canoeists, the ones that never tumped over, would go by the rock, and then they would get out and come back and watch the rest of us turn over. But on this trip, Carol and I did real well. I was really proud, and I had been scared. I'd been nervous after having such a dismal trip before. And my colleague who organized these trips was extremely cautious. He would group our canoes. We had 50 people on this trip, so we had a bunch of canoes, 25 canoes. And so Jamie would group the people, the canoeists. And there would in groups of 3, and there would be one person in the canoe that would have a rope in the canoe, and that person was a very experienced canoeist. So anyway, I remember him saying that when you get to the end of the near the takeout place, you can go. The river forks, and you need to go to the right. And if you go to the left, then you will miss your takeout. So the river went like that. And so I just overheard that. I didn't have to pay attention because I was not the one, and I was not the one that was the most experienced canoeist in this three group period. And he said, everybody stay together, keep with your group. And we did. We did really well until after lunch, and the river got a little wider, and people started swimming and doing all kinds of other, just playing around. And the groups of three dissolved, and people just sort of strung out along the river. I got to a place in the river, and it did not look like a fork to me. So I took the left strand of the river, and I heard, in a little bit, I heard car doors slamming off to the right, because there were people who had taken the right fork who were already getting into their cars, because we had earlier put the cars down there. And I realized, I even prayed, oh God, I had missed the turnout, the takeout place. And so here it was Carol and I and the river. Anybody seen Deliverance? Carol and I and the river. And so it was amazing. I thought about what we should do, because when in a fast river, you don't turn around and go back up the river. You can't do that in this river, anyway. So I said, okay. And then I remembered, I paused a minute, and I remembered that Jamie said, well, if you miss your takeout, you'll go on, the next place to get out is Irby's Ford. And so I thought, oh, there is another place to get out, but it's Irby's Ford. So Carol and I were on the river, all alone, no backup, and we didn't tumble over at all. And we got to Irby's Ford, and there was this man who lived in a cabin there, washing his feet in the river. And so we pulled over, and I said, "Is this Irby's Ford?" And he said yes. And I said, "Do you have a telephone?" He said yes, but it costs money to use that phone. And I said, "Well, we have a little money. We'll pay you to use your phone." In a little bit, coming down the river behind us was Rusty Jones. Rusty was a sophomore that year, and he was the son of Jamie Jones. And when I saw Rusty, I knew, they knew we were lost. They actually had counted noses back at the takeout place, and it would have been tragic if everybody just gone home. And then I also, Rusty said, I'm here and I'll help you. Let's just wait. And I called the people who were the outfitters. I told them what had happened, and they said, "You did what?" It was like 3 or 4 miles down the river, but it was 20-something miles to come in by car. I had a lot of emotions during that trip. Frustration, fear. All of those are things that all those feelings are part of being lost. And I was thinking about all the times that I have been lost, physically lost. And I've been thinking about all the times that I have been lost in other ways. Times when I knew where I was, but I really felt lost. Losing my place and being found again is significant. It's nice to know that someone comes down the river looking for you. But losing somebody else and losing other things is really sort of an ongoing frustration at our house. The phrase that is used the most at our house, more than any other phrase, is, "Have you seen my?" Have you seen my keys? Have you seen my wallet? Have you seen my phone? Have you seen my hearing aids? So losing, I know what it's like to lose things. And we know what it's like to lose things permanently. Also, I know what it's like to lose people. And I don't mean just lose people who have died. I mean, I've actually lost people. And I don't mean losing friends. I mean, I really have lost people. One of the years that I was at Mississippi State, one of my last years there, I decided on spring break to go to San Antonio, Texas. Every year, Diana Bridges, who was our international coordinator, would take a group, two van loads of international students to her hometown, San Antonio, great city, and to show them around. The last year I was there at Mississippi State, I decided to go with them. It was a great week. About the middle of the week, we'd toured the missions in the area. We'd come back together. We were tired, and then we were going to Diana's church for dinner. When we got to the church, we counted noses, and we were missing a student. And so we looked and we looked, we asked everyone, have you seen this student? Have you seen this student? Have you seen this person? Nobody knew. They said, well, we saw her earlier, but we don't know where. We haven't seen her in quite a while. We panicked, of course. Then we calmed down, we called around, and Diana called back to her house where we had gathered earlier. And this student from Thailand had fallen asleep in the backyard in a lounge chair. And when she had awakened, everybody was gone. And she did the only thing she could think to do. She walked up the street to the Catholic Church, because we had toured the Catholic Church earlier, and went in. And that was for her a place of sanctuary, a place to wait, a place where she might be able to get hope and help. I've lost children. For a while there, two of my sons were singing in youth choir, and my wife was singing in adult choir. And Jason was in nursery. Was in the nursery. He was a baby. I would always on Wednesday nights, the night we had all these choirs going on. I would take my children and some children from the neighborhood whose parents sang in the choir and take them home. And I remember one Wednesday, I dropped off the Watson children. And I looked around, and I had forgotten to get Jason. stories. I hope that these are sort of sparking something within you, helping you to remember to think about the things you've lost and the things that, and maybe the times that you have been lost. Luke 15 is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. It contains 3 parables, 3 stories that are stories that are more than stories. They're stories that have content, and they're like pieces of music or art. The stories are sort of work around the offenses in my life and sort of slip up on my heart and speak to me. 2 of those stories are parables Two of those stories are parables about lost sheep and lost coins. The 3rd story is about a lost son. In the reading that Leslie did today, we read the first 2 stories. That's the lectionary stories. Sometime earlier, I think we've already covered we've already had a sermon on the lost son. Part of my affection for this chapter is that the gospel writer, the gospel is sort of a story within a story. It's like the gospel writer describes the audience that's receiving these parables. The gospel writer tells us who it is that is surrounding Jesus and why Jesus tells these 3 parables. And in my imagination, I picture these 3 groups gathered around Jesus. The first group, Luke calls tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus had been hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. Tax collectors, most of you have Sunday school backgrounds or have been around the church long enough that you know that the tax collectors in that day were local people who were hired to collect the taxes, and they made profit by overcharging. And so they were despicable. Can you imagine? None of us like to pay taxes. But can you imagine there being an inconsistency in the charge, and there also and that the people who were collecting the taxes were getting rich. And then there were sinners. These were like known people who were who charged were guilty of usury. They could be people that were known for their immorality. They could be, but they were drawn to Jesus, and Jesus seemed to welcome them. Not only did he welcome them, he ate with them. And there's something sacred about eating with people. If we have our choices, we eat with people we like. When I was a student in the early days of integration, and I think I've told you this story. As I felt like God was calling me to cross the racial lines and befriend the African American students on our campus, I was along the way during my day. I looked for every opportunity to speak to these men and women that I was getting to know on our campus. Sometimes we'd finish a class and walk across campus to the cafeteria, and we'd go in and we would eat, we would get our food, and then they would go to a table where they were all black students, and I would go to a table where there were all white students. And one day I thought, this is silly. And we've had conversation all the way across campus. So what, so I got my tray, and they went to their table, and I went to their table. And they were shocked that they welcomed me. But there were people on campus. A friend of mine came up and said, "Ken, you're really blowing this. So you're real involved in the Baptist Student Union. You're a leader, and you're just sort of really blowing this because you're eating with the other, So sort of the same kind of criticism that that the religious leaders, who was made up another group of the people listening to this parable, this was the criticism that the religious leaders had toward Jesus, was that not only does he befriend these people, those people, but he welcomes them and eats with them. As in the third group that was standing there listening to these stories, were the third group was a group of disciples. People who saw in Jesus that Jesus was a unique person. And they had heard his call to them, and they were following him, and they were learning. And so they were around picking up and learning these stories from the stories that Jesus told. The stories are, I don't know if the tax collectors and sinners recognized and realized that when Jesus talked about a lost sheep, I don't know if they realized that he was talking about them. I don't know that they felt lost. They may have been content to be where they were. But in the story, it was obvious to us reading now, and as Jesus began to unfold all three of these stories, it was real obvious that the lost sheep, coined son in the stories represented this group that was outside the circle, this lost group. What does it mean to be lost? You know, we've used that word a lot theologically in the world that I've come from. We talk about people being lost, meaning them being away from God. We talk about them being lost, actually being condemned. But in this story, those who are lost are those that are outside. They're outside the fellowship and the family of God. They are the excluded ones. And Jesus uses physical lostness to talk about a social lostness that was going on there, a spiritual lostness, a relational lostness that was there. Ken Hill is a Canadian psychologist who has a book out on the psychology of lost. He says the lost person is unable to identify or orient his present location with respect to known locations and has no effective means or methods of reorienting himself. He said, note that this is a two-part definition involving both a confusion with respect to the geographical position as well as an inability to reacquire one's orientation. Basically, he's saying that if you may not recognize where you are, but that doesn't mean you're lost. You know, if you know how to get to where you want to be, or how to get back to where you see something that you recognize, then you're not lost. Helen has this from the early days of our relationship. She told me that she had trouble with feeling lost, and that her sense of direction was off. She even said that sometimes it seems so just what's the word used? Anyway, use, yeah, it seems just counterintuitive. Counterintuitive. She said, it's counterintuitive for me to, I just know this is the direction. But if you go that direction, probably you're going to be going the wrong way. And when we were moving to Columbus, I was several months behind. Helen had come over early. And we talked on the phone. We'd rented an apartment to give us some time to find the place we wanted to buy. And so I talked on the phone, and Helen said, well, I went out to this area and this area and this area. And I'm thinking, Helen, you're always afraid you're going to get lost. What's that like for you? She said, well, I have a GPS. And this was the early days of GPS, before we were really using our phones. But she said, I have a GPS. So I just, I'm not worried at all. I can go to any neighborhood, and then I just let the GPS lead me back home. One time she was returning home, and a rainstorm, and a thunderstorm hit while she was driving. And I don't think it happens as much now, but then there was the early days of GPS, right? A thunderstorm could knock you out off your signal off. And so when that happened, she paused and pulled over and waited for the rain to pass. And the GPS came back on, and she obviously found her way home. Being lost is, as I said, it's more than we use the word lostness and being lost in ways other than just to describe our being out in a strange environment. I took a math class as a freshman, and I was lost. It said to me right away that you are not made to be an engineer. There have been people who have died in my life. In a year and a half, as most of us have lost people. And in losing people to death, in our grief, sometimes the only way to describe what we're feeling is that we're lost. I've seen the passing of significant people in the family, in the family circle. And it's like the stars, we all wait until the stars realign themselves, and we feel lost. Loss is a term that we use often to describe our physical uncomfortableness with discomfort with the environment we're in and our lack of knowledge of where we are, but also just the inability to function. Greg Lavoie, in an article in Psychology Today, The Art of Being Lost, gives us some suggestions. But what do you do when you're lost? What do you do when you can't quite see the way? He wrote this after getting lost on a hike near Lake Tahoe, and when he realized he was lost, in fact, one time he even fell down, and he just sat there for a minute, and he realized that he needed help, and eventually ran into some hikers and he asked them, told them where his car. And they said, "Oh, that's 3 hours from here," and it was getting dark. And so he decided to hitchhike along the road, and nobody would pick him up because it was during the pandemic, and no one would pick him up. But someone did roll down the window and talk with him through the window and said, "Well, we'll call the the highway patrol. Called the highway patrol, and the highway patrol came and they said, and he said, "Can you take me to my car?" And he says, "No, we're not allowed to do that because of liability, but we will call you a taxi." So $50 down the road, he finally made it back to his car. Here's some tips. If you're lost, it's important that you admit that you're lost. You know, and I would have done a lot better with that math class if I had admitted that I was lost and gotten help or gotten out. Second thing is, when you're lost, stop. Don't keep moving. Pause. David Wagner says in a poem called Lost, he says, "Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here." Well, that doesn't get you home, but it does give you a chance. It does give your soul a chance to catch up with you. And it gives you a chance to make a plan. And you might remember that Irby's Ford is down the river. The third suggestion is turn to the people and practices that help you feel grounded and close to the center of oneself. Lavoie lists things like journalism, piano playing, dream work, friendship, love, deep conversation, gratitude, nature as the things that help him feel grounded. And to engage in these things, not for the sake of distraction, but for the sake of traction. Not to take your mind off your lostness, but to give you a place to stand, a place to ground yourself, and to get a grip on yourself. The fourth thing that Lavoie suggests is that you actually sort of embrace the lostness, the chaos that you're in your life. He says that the major creation story in Western culture is in Genesis. And the world was formed out of chaos. And when we are lost, the world looks chaotic to us. But our brain is made to respond to the chaos. We don't have to be afraid. So all of these stories, and I can tell you some more that would make me look more stupid, but all of these stories, you know, are sort of parables to me. Your lost stories, I hope, will be parables for you. And my experience has been that all along the way, the shepherd has come and found me. The house owner has put me in my right place. And I have, and sometimes I look up and I see him coming down the river, saved from the rapids.